In a world of business complexity, execution is everything. This is JD and the Brain, where failure was not an option and performance isn't accidental. Let's get to work.
Welcome to JD and the Brain podcast, the praxis of business where leadership theory meets operational reality. Because performance doesn't happen by accident. I'm Dr. T. Wiles Fowler, author of the CEO's Stamp of Approval, a leadership system designed to drive performance through support, teamwork, aptitude, and morale. And joining me today is my co-host, JD Cecilia, former SCS leader with the Department of Defense. Together, we've led and transformed some of the most complex organizations in the world, including the Pentagon. We bring over 8 decades of experience studying the one system every organization depends on, but few really understand. That is the human system of leadership. In business, we talk about strategy, culture, innovation, but the real battle is in the space between ideas and results. That space is called praxis, Praxis. One of us builds the frameworks that create momentum. The other brings operational design where results were never optional. And together we break down why organizations stall, where leaders lose momentum, and how to build systems that actually perform. If you're serious about moving from intention to execution, then this isn't just a it's a system. Welcome to the conversation. Over to you, sir.
All right. Well, first of all, Tim, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to do this. I've had an opportunity over the last 30, 40 years to work from the military perspective, a government civilian, and also in the private sector. And through those different environments, there are a couple of common threads. And as you mentioned it in your introduction, it's the human part of performance that often gets overlooked. One of the things I've learned is that you can have the most perfect solution to a problem. And if the people aren't ready, if they haven't been trained, if they don't have any confidence in their leadership, if they feel like this is going to set them up for failure, most likely that objective will not be met, and it's because of the human aspect was overlooked. So super excited to be part of the podcast. Looking forward to a number of events with you. I hope we have some great dialogue and that people really get something from what we're talking about. And the most important thing I think from our podcast perspective is the follow-up. I hope that people after hearing this between you and I and other guests, they say, you know what, I think some of this would work in my organization. I'm going to give it a shot. So that's what I'm hoping for.
Wow, that's great. That's exactly my prayer and my hope as well. There's a book out by Lencioni called The Ideal Team Player, and I read it for my doctorate, and he talks about 3 traits that the ideal team player has. One is smarts. They have some type of emotional and social strength about them. They can read a room, kind of a thing. That's the first thing. The second thing is they have a real sense of humility about them. And then thirdly, they're hungry. That kind of mentions what you had talked about before, that they want to be, good learners and quick learners. So when you have somebody that's one of the 3, they get walked on. So if they're smart and they don't have the other 2 characteristics, they appear to be arrogant and people turn them off. They don't invite them into the meetings. And if they're just humble, then you get walked on, and then people don't listen to you either way, and then and then your self-esteem goes down, and it's just an ugly, toxic situation. And then if you're too aggressive and you want to learn, and you're a horseshack, that was a boomer joke. Sorry, you pick me kind of thing. People get are turned off by that. So Lencioni's point is when all 3 work together, when you're socially and emotionally intelligent, when you bring a sense of humility to your teams, and then when you're a quick learner and you want to grow, when you blend all those 3 things, the apex in the in the center is that makes a good team player. So that has been kind of my mantra for the last year, is to try to drive those 3 characteristics. I work in healthcare. I work with a lot of smart people, a lot of good people, a lot of loving people, hardworking people. And the things that we deal with are often very complex, so you can't come in there like a bull in a china shop. You've got to just be hungry to learn more, be humble as you present your opinions on things, and then try to be smart and intellectual and read the room and see what people's body language are showing. Those 3 things. They've seemed to have helped me in the long run.
I think one of the things you just mentioned is, being able to read the room and coming across. And as I say, you only get one chance to make a first impression. And when you're leading a change or you're leading an organization to achieve something, that very first impression that people get of you is going to really kind of color their perspective of you for the rest of the time. And if you come across as humble, as empathetic, as someone who's energized and wants this to happen, so in other words, they're bought into it, they're committed to it, it makes a difference in how they respond to you. So I think those are great attributes. I think all of us probably thought of those ourselves a little bit, but I like the nice, concise way that you describe them. And I think that's, again, it just reinforces some of the points we've made before, that about the human element of how important that is, particularly at the leadership level.
Absolutely. I was with a manager today, and they were presenting their metric board, and it was amazing, and part of the performance piece of the stamp of approval is to catch people doing things right. Mm-hmm. And I loved on him. I said, hey, listen, man, this is hard work. You're tracking the right things. And I just want you to know, fantastic job. And you could see he kind of got a little flushed. He was kind of surprised that somebody from corporate, from staff, recognized him. But I wanted to let him know that I really appreciated his hard work, and it's obvious that he's put in the time, and I think he appreciated the little nod.
So as I was reading your book and the part that came about catch people doing things the right way, and I'm sure you experienced this when you were deployed in those different military operations, about the commander's coin. Do you remember getting one of those? Remember?
I got about a dozen of them.
Yes. Okay. So it's so funny that that's part of your book, but I mean, you experienced it. In other words, good leaders carried a handful of those around in their cargo pocket as they walked throughout the operations area. And when they found somebody doing the right thing, it was an on-the-spot presentation of a commander's coin. Now, again, there are some people who think, oh, that's kind of cheesy, but actually, I will guarantee you that anybody who's ever been given one still has it. I mean,
oh, absolutely. And I always liked the ones where they didn't tell you. They just shook your hand and it was
exactly. And it was in the palm of their hand. And
yeah. It was like,
he just greased my palm. How cool is that?
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, sir. Yeah. No, that made the week.
In your book, you talk about that, but you experienced it both from a recipient of someone who caught you doing something right, and the way you reinforce that manager who was doing things right. So again, that's what I liked about the book, is that you could actually put a real world scenario based on the literature, based on the academic findings, that this actually works. And I've seen it happen, I've experienced. So again, I still have the ones I received. In fact, you can get little plaques, holders, or you can line them up and stuff to make it. For the longest time, I just had them in a cigar box, and my wife finally got on me and said, why don't we put those up someplace? So she got me one for Christmas. But it's right. I can remember every one of them.
Nice. Yeah. So this, I call this the Proxys booth. I'm in the Proxys booth.
Okay.
But we're moving to a new house. So there'll be a new Proxys booth. So some of that awards and rewards and recognition, I'll probably put back there somewhere in the background of the Proxys booth. So what are your hopes for, the podcast and for future intervention? Like we had talked about before, the book, the system, academic, business related, and, thought leadership. What are your thoughts and hopes for the podcast in our future?
I think if I had to sum it up in very few bullet points, the first one would be to make a connection. I want the book, I want the podcast, I want the recollection to make a connection with the person who's receiving it. Like, I get it. I experienced some of that, or boy, I wish I would have done that differently. So the first one is a connection, and that goes back to the Proxys comments you've made earlier about the synaptic gap, right? You're connecting the thought to the operation. It's that bridging from academic to operational. So my main hope and purpose for these would be that someone listening can make the connection. And it's not an academic exercise. It's a blueprint, or it's the next steps, or it's a checklist, or it's something that drives them to an operational outcome. So that's number one. I think as we go through this podcast, we'll pull more of them out, but that's the first thing. If someone was watching this or listening to it, I'd say that's what I want them to make.
So when did you first, start to be interested in continuous improvement? And were you able to take, performance principles, lean training, were you able to synthesize that with real operations in your mind? And then in actuality, how did you drive improvement so that it was real and it was sustainable and it wasn't perceived as something additional to your normal job?
Well, so that's a great question, and my answer will come kind of in two parts. The first was the individual acknowledgement that I needed a more methodical, repeatable way to improve performance. For the first several years of my adult life and my profession, I did kind of by instinct, right? Like if this was a low score, let's focus on it, let's find out. But when I realized that I was creating a blueprint every single time I was trying to solve a problem, it got to be very tiresome. So I said, what I'd really like to do is have a start point that I can use every time and a suggested next steps for every time, because no two problems are going to be the same. So one of the first things I did is I looked at the problem solving methodologies that were available, and I studied them, and I said, this Lean Six Sigma thing, I've never been to a single course, hadn't even heard the word before. I said, it makes perfect sense to me. So I think looking back, one of the smartest things I ever did is the first time I got to hire somebody, I hired a master black belt that had 25 years of experience. And I said, you are infinitely smarter than me in this particular methodology. Make me smart and help me to make our organizations better. So the first thing he said was, first you need to get the education. So boom, I sent myself to a school. I came back and immediately applied it because, one of the things I liked about Lean Six Sigma was you didn't get certified till you finished a project.
Yes, there was some integrity and rigor to it back in the day. Yeah.
So it wasn't like you could go coast in these week-long classes. Black belt was 4 weeks long, 1 week a month for 4 months.
Yeah.
I mean, you couldn't just be a tourist. That's what we used to call people that were just there for the ride. If you really wanted to get certified, you had to come back with demonstrated results. So that was kind of cutting my teeth on how you could actually improve a performance with a repeatable methodology. So that was my observation. And like I said, I hired somebody much smarter than me in that particular realm. And they turned out to be great mentors from the methodology perspective. And so that got the ball rolling. But continuous improvement also means continuous learning. And so months or a year would go by, and then I went in and had enough work to do that I said, I should be a master black belt too. So that's when I went to the master black. And back then, that was an arduous process. So it was time consuming, it was hard work, it was expensive. I mean, it was just all those things that kept really the people who didn't want it out of it. And so what you had back in the day were some really sharp people that were wholly committed. So that's how I individually prepared myself. But the bigger question was, how was I going to get the organization ready? Well, the first thing I learned is there are some people that have a visceral reaction to the term Lean Six Sigma. I mean, they just freak out. They are so opposed to it. So as I was watching these weird reactions, I said, well, you know what? I'm not gonna poke that thing. I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to change the name. So I stopped using the term Lean Six Sigma and just changed, and with the help of my boss, changed it to performance management. Now, who can be against that? Right?
That's right.
So it's not only did I have to individually prepare myself and get schooled up and certified in these different methodologies, but I had to also figure out a way that I could bring it to the organization without creating unnecessary resistance. And to me, that was the real secret, is getting the people to not know that they're doing something that they didn't like. They just noticed that the results were better.
Wow, that's great. So the stamp of approval is a performance management thought process and practice. Okay. Performance is an outcome. It's the fruit. Okay. It's the byproduct of some things, and when we tell organizations, just get better, what we're saying is, hey, you apples, turn into oranges. That doesn't happen. You got to go upstream and change the seeds, okay? And then you can change the fruit at the end of it. So the support, leadership, flexibility, human resource, employee engagement and aptitude development, talent development, and then how do you relate to other team members, interpersonal skills, interdependence. One ox can pull 8,000 pounds. That's a lot. two can pull 26,000 pounds because of that tandem effort. So I call that the power of interdependence. So that's the management, four management pieces, that result in performance. So the book, it has basically 25 concepts to it. They're like 5 rows: support, teamwork, aptitude, morale, and there's like 5 slices. So that's like 25 things to learn. Is it too much for somebody to learn all that stuff? And
Well, first of all, I use the term learn kind of in a different way. In other words, there are some people that think you have to have it memorized in order to have learned it. Others, and this is the school of thought that I ascribe to, and that is, I don't have to memorize everything. I just have to know where to get it. And so if you have 25 things that you could say you have to learn, it's I just know where the 25 are. And so if I'm in an organization where I have a particular need and they have a particular deficiency or shortfall, I don't have to try and sort through all 20. I can go to the one I need because I've already read them all. I understand what they are, but I don't have to commit them to memory. I go read the directions.
yeah,
In culinary school, I had to make many, many different dishes. And
guys, he made me pig ears. Okay, we had pig ear salad. It was amazing. Remember that?
Yeah, yeah. Until you said that, I hadn't remembered that, but now I remember it. That was a fun night.
That was great. Yeah.
Well, my point was that, like, while you will learn many different things as you do them, I'm not going to commit 150 recipes to memory. So, but I'll know where to get them and I'll know where to look for them. So the stamp of approval is more like an index to, let's go to this chapter, let's go to this function, let's go to this objective or performance aspect. And let's just again, do a cursory read. Oh yeah, got it, and then you move out. So I don't think it's too many. I think it's just a nice compilation of where to find.
Well, that's excellent. Good thought. So as we think about the next 25 weeks, we're going to touch each of those 25 points. So the first rung, in the stamp of approval is leadership. We call it the leads continuum. Okay, LEADS. And it moves from authoritative to participative. And there's a continuum, a spectrum in between. And it's all situationally based. Okay. So the next podcast will be on the leader mode. Okay. And the leader mode tells you what you need to do. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. Taichi Ono, the founder of the Toyota production system, he used to say, it is this way or the highway, and Burger King is hiring. So, they really set the standard. And what we're going to learn is being autocratic about standards allows leaders to be participative with the people, to come up with ideas to improve things and to make them better. And when the system is mature enough to be run by a standard and not the personality of the guy in the corner office, people know that if they bring forth their good ideas backed by data, they're going to be recognized for their good work and they're going to get promoted, or they're going to have greater influence. What a motivating factor that is. So many organizations today, people get discouraged and then we call it quiet quitting. They just smile and wave, and don't jump in and try to improve. So that's kind of the schedule as we go forward. So just as a reminder, the podcast will be a welcome. There'll be a theme. And then there'll be a shout out to a leader who has a quote, primarily a business guru who has a quote that's relevant to that theme for that podcast. And then we'll have discussions between you and I. We'll do some interviewing of some leaders in the community and in the country. And then we'll reinforce, the system through the 4. So guys, we appreciate you joining in and jumping in. So if you look behind us here, so it says there where leadership theory meets operational reality. I'm a right brain, total right brain. So I'm going to bring a lot of theory and a lot of, challenge to people's thinking. And JD's, been in operations where failure was not an option. So we're going to try to bridge that gap, and that's called praxis. That's why this is the praxis booth. So JD, any final thoughts for our second podcast today?
Yeah, the thing I'd like to hit on and just highlight just a bit is when you talked about the leads format, and I think you used the word continuum. And that is how a good leader needs to be well versed in all of those aspects, all of those approaches, because in any given day, they may have to use all of them at one point or another. So It's not just being an autocratic leader 24/7. You have to be able to be a good leader. You have to be able to adjust your style to the situation. So I think that was a great point that you brought out in the book, that it's a continuum. It's not static. It's dynamic, and it's going to change probably every day.
And the more, experiences we go through, the pain that we feel, the frustration that we experience, all of that, is just another notch in the tool belt to either know how to do something or not to do it.
Yeah.
We learn through experience. Well, guys, thank you so much for joining us. We're excited about kicking off this third podcast about the leads continuum, and we're going to focus on the leader. Let me just plan a quick. Sometimes leaders in the leader role are rude and mean, okay? And people get offended by that. But it might just be the best thing that could happen to you. If you're in a theater and the fire breaks out and the fire's in the south exit and the attendant comes in there and says, you guys got to leave, there's a fire, and you start to head to the south exit because you don't know that that's where the fire is, that bellman, that attendant, they may curse at you and yell at you, okay? They may be rude to you, okay? And you may be offended by that. But that's probably what saved your life and everyone's life in the theater, including the bellman's life. So don't always judge a book by its cover, so to speak. There may be a reason for a leader to give stern, clear direction. And we'll talk about that at our next get-together. All right, guys, we'll see you next time. Thanks for joining JD and the Brain.
Support the mission. Align your team. Build capability. Leverage Teaming Plus for alliances. Because performance doesn't happen by accident. This has been JD and the Brain.